Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Carlin Bowman. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'd like to welcome all of you and our C-SPAN audience to this post-election analysis of the 2018 midterms. AEI began this program in 1982, and today's session is our 19th biennial election postmortem. We had a very busy day yesterday, poring over results in 155 state ballot measures, more than 6,000 legislative contests, 36 governor's races, 435 House and 35 Senate contests. With me to discuss some of these results are my current and former AEI colleagues. First, AEI resident fellow Michael Barone, who founded the Almanac of American Politics many years ago. His knowledge of American political history makes him one of the best political analysts in the country. I believe Michael has actually set foot in all 435 congressional districts. John Fortier is director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. John's 2004 AEI book on early and absentee voting anticipated the revolution in early or convenience voting that we saw in this election. Our former colleague Henry Olson is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Henry is one of the most important voices in the country on the Republican Party's past and its future. On Monday, he made his predictions of what would happen on Election Day, and he'll be discussing them here today. My longtime colleague and friend, Norm Ornstein, is Washington's preeminent Congress watcher. Norm is one of the original authors of the invaluable guide, Vital Statistics on Congress, now available on Brookings' website, from which we draw so much of our understanding of congressional election. We on this panel are especially grateful to our research assistant, Eleanor O'Neill. This program couldn't happen without her. We're also appreciative of the work of our intern this fall, Jackie Clements. So let's begin. We're going to start with a lightning round. I will ask each panelist to tell us in 2 minutes what they thought was most interesting about this election. 2 minutes, Michael Barone.
Well, you mentioned the year 1982 as the first year of this session, and it reminded me that that's the last time American voters gave us the combination of Republican President, Republican Senate, Democratic House. So in 36 years, there's a certain repetition. My big surprise was watching the returns coming in from Florida this year. It was very much like watching the returns coming in from Florida in 2018. You had the Democrats were favored in both cases. The early returns showed them ahead. When you checked the big county percentages versus previous performance, it looked like the Democrats were headed to victory, that Andrew Gillum would be elected governor and Bill Nelson would be reelected to his fourth term in the U.S. Senate, just as we expected Hillary Clinton to carry Florida, but as the in 2016. But as the numbers kept coming in, the Democratic margin of reported returns kept going down, and so it had been what looked like a Democratic carry in the 8 o'clock hour looked like the Democratic percentages were disappearing, and it was the small counties and the big trend towards Donald Trump outside the major million-plus metro areas that explained, I think, what happened in Florida in 2016 and explained what appears to have happened in Florida in 2018 with Ron DeSantis elected governor and Rick Scott elected to the U.S. Senate. Now, people are... Yep.
Sorry. John, your most interesting moment, and you can't repeat what Michael just said.
So I will go with two quick vignettes. One, I'm a big proponent that we have improved our election system, the way we run elections. It is still not perfect. It's a very complex system. But there are always glitches, and some of them, one struck me. In Arizona this year, we had a polling place which failed to open on time because the night before, someone had foreclosed on the building. So they did resolve that. They did actually come through and open up, and people got to vote. But there was a glitch at the beginning. The second I'll quickly point to, for those interested in electoral reform, some who are proponents of a electoral reform called ranked choice voting. And in Maine, there's been some adoption of it, at least in some races. There's still a very interesting race in Maine 2 out there, which this may kick in. The Republican Bruce Poliquin is leading, but once we start calculating the secondary preferences, he may not be ahead. And there are some possibilities of legal challenges to that as we go forward.
Henry, your most interesting finding in 2 minutes.
The return of the Obama-Trump voter, that the polls going into the race suggested a Democrat recreation of the Midwestern blue wall, and that was going to be built on the return of blue-collar Democrats who had voted for President Trump to their ancestral party. It didn't happen. That's why Kim Reynolds won Iowa. It's why Mike DeWine won Ohio. It's why John James, with no attention and no outside support, got 46% in the Michigan Senate race, and why Scott Walker almost pulled it off. You also see it in the Senate races, that if you look at compare 2012 results for Heitkamp and Donnelly and McCaskill in North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri, if you look at the cities and the suburbs, they won enough of the vote compared to how they did 6 years before that they should have been returning. But those states are predominantly rural. They're Obama-Trump territory, and they lost massively outside of those areas, and that's why none of those races was ever close, the return of the Obama-Trump voter.
Norm, your quick take.
So first I turn to the great political analyst Andy Borowitz, who today said, Trump unable to stop caravan of Democratic women invading Washington. And that is one of the striking features of the election itself, or two of them there. But in the next Congress, there'll be at least 99 women among Democrats in the House and Senate to something like 19 for the Republicans. So the parties are very, very different than what we have now. They're different in the racial composition, but they're also different not just at the mass level, but as we look at our political characteristics. We have a party that, if you look at the Democrats coming in both houses, is going to have far more minorities than anybody else, and white males are a distinct minority among Democrats in Congress. White males are the overwhelming cast of the Republicans in Congress. And I think we're going to see deeper and starker divisions among the parties. And the other thing that struck me was the level of tribalism in the electorate showing in different ways. Democrats did extraordinarily well in the House. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But there wasn't a single district that Trump carried by more than 55% where a Democrat won. So they won in suburban areas. They won in places where Hillary Clinton had won in the district the last time. But if you had a distinct red coloration to the district, even in a year where there was a wave focus, it didn't extend very far. And, of course, we saw that in many of these Senate races as well.
Thanks, Norm. Before we take our deeper dive into specifics, I'd like to say just a few words about the polls. The exit poll consortium this year consisted of the 4 networks and Edison Research in New Jersey. The Associated Press, which has been collecting and tallying raw vote totals in the country ever since 1848, left the consortium in 2017 to try something new. AP, working with one of the best polling outfits in the country, NORC at the University of Chicago, conducted 95,000 interviews in the last 6 days of the campaign with a more extensive questionnaire than the exit pollsters can use. Fox also decided to leave the exit poll consortium, and it too joined the new AP Votecast on election night. So this year, for analysis, we have a poll of voters from the exit poll consortium, and we also have the AP NORC experiment. We're going to be comparing some of the results of these 2 different approaches in the new issue of AEI's political report, which we hope to get out very soon. Let me just touch on 2 things that I thought were very interesting in the polls. We always hear that off-year elections are referenda on the party in power. Fortunately, the exit pollsters have asked a question that gets at this sentiment going back to 1990. What's interesting to us is that more people than in the 1990s are saying that the president was a factor in their vote. In 1990, 34% said that their vote was to express support or opposition for the president. In 1994, 45% gave that response about Bill Clinton. In 2006 and 2010, around 55% said that their vote was to express support or opposition for Bush or Obama. This year, nearly 2/3 of voters gave those responses. How did they break? 26% of voters in this election said their vote was a vote to express support for Donald Trump, 38% a vote to express opposition, and a third said that he wasn't a factor. Our politics have become more nationalized, and presidents are playing a much larger role in votes than they have in past off-year elections. Let me say a word about the women's vote. Norm touched on this. Women, and of course especially Democratic women, had many victories on Tuesday night. And as we have seen in every election since 1980, men and women have voted differently. In this election, 59% of women voted for the Democratic candidate, while 40% of them voted for the Republican. Men voted narrowly for the Republican candidate. Despite a lot of misreporting that the gender gap would be huge, the gender gap was 15 points, very much what it has been in past election cycles. Women are, of course, a larger share of the electorate than men. In every racial and ethnic group, women were more Democratic than men. White women split their votes evenly in this election, but white men voted 60% for Republican House candidates and 39% for Democratic ones. There were significant differences among women by education. White female college grads were 16% of all voters. They voted 59 to 39 for Democratic candidates. While females without a college degree were a slightly larger share of voters, 21%, they voted only 42% for Democratic candidates and 56% for Republican ones. This will be, as Norm said, the largest class of freshman women ever, with overwhelming representation by Democratic women. It remains to be seen whether they will be a cohesive bloc. Now let me turn to my colleagues, and we will begin first with Michael to talk about the Senate races. Michael.
Thank you, Carolyn.
7 minutes.
Okay. Whoa. The political commentator Joy Behar said the Democrats did badly in the Senate races because of gerrymandering, apparently. She's under the impression that the boundaries of the states are redrawn every couple of years.
17th century English gerrymandering?
Well, they've got we've got some Democrats that are calling for changing the Constitution so that each state doesn't get 2 senators. They don't seem to realize that that's the one provision of the Constitution that can't be amended without a vote's agreement of all 50 states. My own view is that it makes more sense as political strategy to try to win within the system we have rather than try to arrange to get all 50 states to agree to change it. And in fact, when you look at the numbers from 1914, when popular vote for senators came in for all the states in the 17th Amendment, the Democrats have emerged from with majorities in the Senate from 32 elections, Republicans in 21. If the Democrats can't win the Senate this time, it's not because they haven't been able to do it in the past. And in addition, one of the other data that's kind of interesting, going into this election, Democrats held 11 of the 20 seats for both the 10 smallest population and the 10 largest population states. They lost 1 in each group, North Dakota and Florida, so the largest and smallest states are evenly split 10-10 between the parties. The Republicans' majority comes in the 30 medium-sized states. President Donald Trump, in his press conference yesterday, said that the Republicans defied history by gaining seats in the Senate. Actually, that happens on a number of occasions. As I mentioned earlier, in 1982. If you go back to 1962, the president's party gains 4 seats. And there's a sort of structural reason for that. In the House of Representatives, every member going into the election was elected 2 years before when the president was elected. In the Senate election, almost every member was elected 6 years before, which is often a landslide or a big margin for the incumbent president of the other party. So there's a structural reason for that, and it obtained in 1962, 1982, and 2018. Now, the Democrats were right to say this was an unfavorable lineup of seats. You had 26 Democratic seats, 10 of which were carried by Donald Trump, 5 by double-digit margins, and only 9 Republican seats, only 1 of which was carried by Clinton. The Republicans lost that seat. The Culinary Union and Harry Reid seem to rule Nevada pretty thoroughly these days. But the Democrats lost seats in North Dakota by 11%, Indiana by 8%, Missouri by 6%. Those were all Trump 19 to 20-point states. Democrats held on to Montana by 2%, West Virginia by 3%. Also, Florida, as I mentioned in my surprise, was a less than 1% race. Rick Scott won 2 governor races by 1% after spending in the 3 elections a total of $230 million of his own money. Seems to have taken the lesson that President Kennedy said his father did when asked why he won by such a narrow margin. He said, "My father said that he was damned if he'd pay for a landslide." In constitutional terms, I think in some ways this was not just an Article I race. Article I is about the Congress, of course, but also an Article III race. The Democrats who lost Senate seats all voted against the Supreme Court nomination of Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Joe Manchin, the one Democratic senator who voted to confirm Kavanaugh, survived by only 3%. In a state where he's been a statewide figure for more than a dozen years. I think it's likely he would have lost if he'd voted the other way. And what this does give is the Republicans appear to have a Senate majority that quite possibly they could maintain into the 2020s, and in any case where they'll be able to confirm judges under the Reed rule that was extended to Supreme Court nominees by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, which is that it's majority vote, no filibuster. The Democrats' coalition of the ascendant, the Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg's term, seems to be based disproportionately, as I examine the results, from white college graduates, especially single women. It's a relatively affluent thing. Democrats were hoping for a blue wave. They got a Whole Foods blue wave, and they did very well in districts and states that have a lot of Whole Foods. When you get away from a Whole Foods and end up seeing the signs for Cracker Barrel, they haven't been doing as well. You've had disappointing black turnout, at least as measured compared to Barack Obama. It appears even in Florida and Georgia, where you had African-American Democratic governor candidates with a serious chance of winning. No surge of young voters to the polls that was disproportionate to those of other voters in a high turnout election. You see I took a look at Hispanics in the seriously contested Senate races and a couple of the governor races as well. And overall, nationally, they voted Democratic by a 69 to 29 margin. That's essentially the same thing the exit poll said about the presidential election in 2016, where Donald Trump did slightly better among Hispanics than Mitt Romney had done. But Republicans did better in some of the states with seriously contested races among Hispanics. Some of them are small sample size, though. Tennessee, they got 46%, Florida, 45% in the Senate and governor races, Missouri, 44%, Georgia, 37%, Texas and Michigan, 35%. That's a very different Hispanic vote. If you go and look at New York, it's 15%. Final point, many Republicans in serious races outperformed their polling, particularly in the Senate races in North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri. I wonder if pollsters are getting all those rural votes, or if the cell phones don't work when you're out on a tractor.
Thank you very much, Michael. John, it was a big night for Democrats in governor's races. Give us your take.
Thank you, Carlin. So first, let me pick up on one thing Michael mentioned indirectly, is that this was a very high turnout midterm election by any measure, and we're still not done counting. Just to put it in perspective, we have seen, since we allowed 18-year-olds to vote in 1970 or after the 1970 election, we haven't seen midterm turnout to be more than 42, low 42 percentage point range. And this election could be easily 46, 47, perhaps 48% by the time we get done counting. We're at 44, 45% now. So it was a big turnout election. Both sides turned out pretty well. Obviously, it was a good Democratic year, and getting back into the governorships, the good Democratic wave, or whatever type of ripple or tsunami, or however you want to describe it, moved across the House races. It moved across governor's races, and moved across other state races, which I'll talk about. In the Senate, I think, was different because of the terrain that wave moved onto. Democrats did pretty well. They were behind in the governorship significantly going into this election, and we knew they were going to pick up 3 seats, and they did, in Illinois, New Mexico, and Michigan. We also knew the Republicans were going to gain a seat back from an independent in Alaska, and that happened as well. But we were focusing really on 8 competitive Senate gubernatorial races. And of those 8, it turns out that the Republicans retained 4, and they also lost 4. So first, the 4 they lost. Democrats did beat Scott Walker in Wisconsin. They won a race against a candidate who was very close to Donald Trump, Chris Kobach, in Kansas. They won in Nevada. They won in Maine. But 4 key Republican holds, or one is still to be absolutely determined. But Florida, of course, was a very large hold. Ohio, where Republicans performed very well across the state, not just in the governor's race, very well in all the other state races, which they swept. Georgia is still technically not called. I think there's a very likelihood that Republicans are going to win that seat. There's a question of whether it's going to go to a runoff. That will be determined fairly soon. There are some votes out there, but my analysis is it's probably not likely, and Republicans will keep that seat, and Iowa as well. So there were 4 strong Republican performances in those 8 seats, 4 wins, 4 losses. Also, just New Hampshire Republicans kept as well. Want to note also there are 3 states that we talked about last time, which are extremely Democratic states where Republicans have kept the governorship in ways that are not always expected. In Maryland, nearby, in Massachusetts, and in Vermont, states that Donald Trump lost by 25 percentage points or more, where Republican governors, moderates in all these cases, won convincingly and kept those seats. I want to shift a little bit to the state legislatures, because again, I think this move in the Democratic direction continued there. But it also has implications for looking forward to redistricting, which will affect the House and other things in the coming decade. State legislative districts tend to move, again, against the president's party. That's a typical move. We saw Barack Obama, when he was president, over 2 elections, lose 900 legislative seats in the 2010 and 2014 elections. We're going to see Democrats pick up somewhere in the 230, 250 seat range, a good number, not quite as much as the move against Obama. I think that has something to do with there was a lot of restructuring of states, realignment of various places, Southern Democrats being replaced by Republicans, but still a pretty good win. They picked up 7 chambers. They picked up chambers in Minnesota, both chambers in New Hampshire, Colorado, Maine, Connecticut, and New York, which I'll come back to. New York was controlled by a coalition, but now Democrats will be in charge of the New York Senate. And then just the importance of this is that we are moving into redistricting season. Redistricting season varies from state to state, where some states have commissions, but most still are going to be determined by who controls the governorship as well as the legislature. There's still a little bit more time for this to change because the next election, a smaller group of governors and some more legislative seats will be up. But most of these governors, all but 2, will be in place for that redistricting, and we have a sense of how it's going to look. And if you remember, from 2012, there was a very, very strong Republican control of state legislatures and governorships, which really helped them in drawing the maps, which helped them hold the House of Representatives for quite a while. And just to look at the very 20 biggest states, Republicans were in charge in 2012 in Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Virginia, Tennessee, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Drew favorable maps to themselves. Some of them changed a little bit by courts at later times. Democrats were in charge in Illinois, Maryland, and technically in Massachusetts because they could override a veto, and drew maps favorable to themselves there. We do have, because of a couple of races Republicans won in the governorship, some retention of that, but there's also been some change. So going forward, Republicans, if things don't change in the next election, will control again in Texas and in Florida, not in Pennsylvania, which is now in divided government. They sort of control in Ohio, but there's a little bit of redistricting reform which may limit what Republicans can do. Georgia, they will continue to control redistricting. North Carolina, even though there is a a Democratic governor. The legislature determines completely. They will be in control. Michigan, your state, it will be divided government, and there's been redistricting reform, which will change that process. Virginia, divided government, again, not Republicans, not in charge. Tennessee, Indiana, yes, and then Wisconsin, where Scott Walker left, no. So it's more of a mixed case. Republicans still will be in charge at a number of important places, but not to the extent that they were before. Let me mention just one other state that's of particular interest, and that is New York. For many, many years, New York has had, while a very Democratic state, has had a divided state legislature. The House was controlled by the Democrats, the Senate controlled by Republicans, and more recently by kind of a coalition of Republicans and a few Democrats. And that meant every time you came to draw the district lines, there was a compromise. Republicans always were able to preserve some element of their districts. They kept the Senate. They gerrymandered the Senate to keep it in their hands, but they also had some say in the federal redistricting for their members of Congress. Looks like this will be gone as now New York has all Democratic legislature and Democratic governor, and while there's been some talk of redistricting reform, that's a big state which Democrats have not actually had the chance to sort of put their stamp on a map in a long time, and I suspect they may down in the future.
John, thank you very much. One quick question. I think I read in Ballotpedia yesterday that the Republicans before this election had 27 trifectas where they controlled the governorship and both houses of the state legislatures, and they're now down to 21. Is that correct?
I think that's right. We still have something out
We
there,
still
but yeah, and then the key large ones, that we don't see anymore, like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, have gone in the other direction. Virginia, yeah.
Thank you, John. Henry, we're now going to turn to you. Henry predicted in National Review what was going to happen on Election Day. He called his piece The Revenge of the Rhinos, Republicans in name only. He looked at 4 kinds of House districts. Henry, tell us what you found and how you did.
Well, I did very well. I said,
Don't mind saying so.
well, she asked. I said, I had Democrats at plus 32 and a high range of 40. It looks like they'll get about 34 to 36, depending how the final votes come out. Right now, I've only missed the 2 closest races, Florida and Arizona. I got all the other ones. But with respect to the House, that's what the story was. And actually, as I mentioned earlier, it's the story a little bit in reverse in the Senate, which is that what happened in 2016 was moderate Republicans, that the group that get derided by conservatives as rhinos, left the party. They voted for Hillary Clinton, and that swung a large number of districts in the suburbs towards Mrs. Clinton, some of which large enough that she carried, like the district that George H.W. Bush represented in Texas went from 21 points for Romney to 1 point for Clinton. The district that his son lives in now in North Dallas went from 15 points to Romney for 1 point for Clinton. And Tom Price's old district, the one that was won in that massive special election last year by Karen Handel, went from 24 for Romney to 1 for Trump. And what the data show is that people who are Romney-Clinton voters are really much more in tune with Democratic views on the issues that President Trump has recast the national coalitions on. They are closer to Democrats on social issues. They are closer to Democrats on immigration. They are closer to Democrats on how to deal with Islamic terrorism. And they are even closer to Democrats on economic inequality. They're much more concerned about that. Within the Republican Party, their profile, when you look at the different candidates who are running, obviously they don't line up with Trump or Cruz, but they also didn't line up with Marco Rubio. They were closest to the John Kasich voter. And John Kasich's support in the Republican primaries was limited almost exclusively to that 20% who called themselves moderates, and a particularly affluent group of that. That's exactly the voters who left the Republican Party in 2016 and gave the House to the Democrats this time. Take a look at any major metropolitan area, and you will find a seat that either went to the Democrats, that Republicans had held, or that narrowly went to the Democrats. And I divided the seats into 4 different tiers in the piece to help illuminate that. The bottom tier, thinking of it as a pyramid, were the 25 Republican-held seats that Hillary Clinton carried. As of this writing, the Democrats have picked up 19 of those, which was exactly what I thought they would pick up. They might pick up one or two more in California, as the 7 million votes that California, or 5 million votes that California is sitting on, they haven't counted, get counted. The next group were the Obama-Trump districts, districts that Republicans held that Obama had won, usually twice, but that went to Trump. The Republicans nationally have a very hard time with this voter. The president understands them, but the party congressional leadership does not, and consequently, this was where they missed their opportunity. There were 12 of those seats that Republicans held, and they have thus far lost 7, and if the main ranked choice voting does doom Bruce Pollock win, that will be 8. On the flip side, the Republicans picked up 2 seats in Democrat-held Obama-Trump seats, but they failed to challenge in a number of others. And in each of those cases, candidates who had no support from the national party and virtually no money, and in case of New Jersey, too, literally no money, got between 45 and 48% of the vote, all on their own. That was a strong partisan support by Obama-Trump voters for a party whose congressional leadership didn't seem to want them. Then you have the group of Trump under 50%, places where the rhinos moved quickly towards Clinton, but there weren't enough of them in 2016 to tip the district. The Democrats won 5 of those seats, and they might end up winning 6, depending on what happens with Mia Love in suburban Salt Lake. They currently lead that, but the balance of votes that are out favor her dramatically. They picked up an exurban seat in Chicago, Illinois 14, Randy Hultgren. They picked up Oakland County outside of Detroit, Michigan 11. They picked up Connor Lamb winning suburban Pittsburgh. They picked up Mickey Sherrill winning exurban New York and Newark and New Jersey 11. And they beat Karen Handel, who conceded this morning. And then you only have 5 seats, to echo what Norm had said, only 5 seats where Trump won over 50%, where Democrats picked up. And a number of those were unique circumstances. Claudia Tenney has been a very controversial conservative congresswoman. All of her living Republican predecessors endorsed the Democrat, and looks like she narrowly lost in New York 22. But Oklahoma City went to the Democrats. That was also a seat that had moved towards Hillary Clinton, even though it still remained Republican. South Carolina won, where Mark Sanford was taken out by a conservative challenger who ran as a Trump person, narrowly lost. Of course, she was running in the district that's the most affluent in the state and moved the most towards Hillary Clinton. So even in these areas, you saw particularly unique circumstances. The takeaway that I've got in the piece, I talked about rhinos and their counterpart, tigers. Trump is great Republicans. These are the blue-collar Democrats. They deserve a nickname. I mean, they're moving the electorate, and people should start looking at them. So the Tigers came out, and they saved a lot of House incumbents. Troy Balderson. If the district had been only suburban Columbus, he would have been wiped out, but it included Tiger Country out in Licking County and Morrow County and Muskingum County, and he won by 4.5 points. It saved French Hill. Little Rock would have elected the Democrat, but he had Tiger Country out in rural Arkansas and so forth. And they elected the Senate Republicans who unseated the incumbents. And I think going forward into 2020, it's going to be very interesting because the Republican leadership will naturally want to go recover their ancestral homelands with rhinos, but they win because of tigers. And the Democrats will want to consolidate their new beachheads in rhino country, but they can't win the Midwest without tigers. And if they can't compete for that, if Trump can improve only slightly on some of the Republican losing challenges in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, then we could very well see a second election in a row where Trump loses the popular vote, wins the Electoral College, and do so by basically telling the rhinos goodbye.
Thank you very much, Henry. Norm, I'd like to ask you about what stands out to you in House races. And in 2 particular questions, you focused a lot on money in politics in your career. And how important was the green wave? I mean, Republicans were outspent in many races across the country this year. And second, how many outstanding races are there at this point? And when do you expect we'll have a final count?
So on the first point, money was huge this time, of course, in 2 ways. Certainly, Democrats had an enormous surge in money. A lot of it was small donors, but they also had a number of billionaires who entered the fray, something we hadn't seen so much before, where it was much more of a skew on the Republican side. And we certainly saw that play out again on the Republican side. Money, in the end, I think, didn't matter so much in many of these races because there was adequate money both for the candidates and for outside groups. The big winners in this election, as has been the case in several recent ones, were local television stations who make out like the bandits they are. So on the House side, we've got, it's still not clear exactly how many are actually outstanding, but we're talking about somewhere around a dozen, and several of them in California, as we've indicated before, because there's so much vote by mail now, it takes them a long time to count those ballots. I would say, as you look at those districts, David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report, who really is the best at this game, who, by the way, coined the Whole Foods Cracker Barrel sort of difference when he looked at counties that had only a Whole Foods and counties that had only a Cracker Barrel, and it's almost perfect way to predict what will happen. But Wasserman notes that usually those votes that come in late favor Democrats. So there are a handful of districts in California where Republicans have an edge, but where the late votes might change that. And then we have the unique case that John had mentioned of ranked choice voting now in Maine. In the end, I think it's possible that Democrats could pick up as many as 38 seats, but somewhere in the range of 36, which doesn't fit the massive wave that we might have considered 40 plus, but it's not a ripple either. It's certainly pretty significant. I want to make a couple of other points. I do want to take 30 seconds. Carlin introduced all of us very effusively, and we need to introduce Carlin just as effusively. Carlin has stage managed and masterminded all of these Election Watch sessions for a very long time, but also Carlin and Eleanor O'Neill, our trusted companion, have put out these incredible Election Watch and Political Watch issues that all of you should get, and all of you who are watching or listening, just to go to AEI.org because it's really valuable and absolutely straightforward information.
Thank you.
Now, we haven't mentioned some of the referendums that are very important here. And the one that got strikingly little attention on election eve, as I went back and forth watching, was the Florida referendum that brings back enfranchisement for former felons. And it was a 60% threshold in an evenly divided state. And what's interesting is it got 67 or 68%, as I saw. So something that has approval across the board, but it has the potential of a profound impact on Florida. 1.5 million people who haven't been able to vote, now able to vote, vast majority of them minorities. Now, not all of them are going to vote, but I think what we will also see, and this was another theme in the election, this sort of an undercurrent, is Florida Republicans in charge are going to find many creative ways to make sure they don't vote. Cutting out early voting, moving polling places to spots where they can't be, purging rolls and doing other things. And we're going to have an ongoing battle in many, many states. And of course in Georgia, where we had the unprecedented Secretary of State, the election official, running for governor, staying in that position. And by the way, as we go through to see whether he gets below that 50% threshold, provisional ballots that have been cast where he will be in charge, I suspect we're going to see court challenges and a lot of other issues. We are the only country, by the way, the only country that calls itself a democracy where the zebras, to use Henry's analogy, the election arbiters are themselves partisans. Imagine how comfortable you would feel if you're watching a World Series and the umpires all were part owners of one of the teams. That's what we do in our elections.
That's what the Yankees are doing wrong.
We also have 4 states where there were referendums creating independent redistricting processes: Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, and Utah. And we also had a ruling by a judge just yesterday about Maryland throwing out its districts. Now, whether judges throw out the partisan gerrymandering for Democrats and not for Republicans remains to be seen, but we're going to see some changes there. Now, very quickly on the House. Almost certainly Nancy Pelosi will be the Speaker of the House. There will be some members who will be uneasy about it. My guess is she may have to say this will be 2 years. There will be a broadening of the leadership to bring in new people. We do not have a surge of ultra-liberal candidates. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez almost stands alone. She's gotten an enormous amount of attention, clearly a vibrant person. But the vast majority of the ones who won are pragmatic progressives, and that's particularly true in some of these districts that Henry was talking about. They are not going to push for Medicare for all. They are going to push for changes within the context of the Affordable Care Act. They will push, very likely, for some control of prescription drug prices. It wouldn't surprise me if the most liberal thing that we see is a national minimum wage of $15, which will make it through the House but not go much further. There will be a substantive agenda. But what we also know from the president's quite striking press conference yesterday, where he said if they go after him with subpoenas, his tax records, with hearings, that he'll get the Senate Republicans to do the same for them, and it will be warfare. But at the same time, it wouldn't surprise me that an infrastructure bill might go through, because it's in the interest both of Democrats and Trump to have something happen. Remember when we had enormous tension between Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, we got welfare reform because Newt wanted to win a second consecutive term for Republicans in the House, and he was more than willing to give up the presidency. Democrats will not be willing to give up the presidency, but we might see something happen. And one final point. If you look at the House votes and project that onto a presidential election next time, Donald Trump could lose the popular vote by 8 or 9 million and still win the Electoral College. Popular will is declining as a force in American politics. By 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, which means that 30% of Americans will elect 70 of the 100 senators. Now, they're not all going to be Democrats and Republicans in those states, as something that Michael pointed out, but they're not going to be representative of the diversity or the vibrancy of the country. And we're going to have challenges to the legitimacy of the political system ahead. Goes way beyond whether Donald Trump is president or not president. We've got issues in the structural nature of our political system that we are going to have to find a way to address.
Thanks very much, Norm. You anticipated my question about governance, but I want to turn to the rest of the panel members to see whether you think there are any areas of cooperation and what those might be, if you have some differences with Norm or agree with him. John.
Yeah, I do think, just first to point out that we are very frequently have a divided government. There has not been a president who served 2 terms since Franklin Roosevelt who hasn't had Congress be controlled by the other party at some point. So this is a norm, at least for part of our time. And I do think that there are some incentives to work together. There are things we have to do, and it isn't going to be pretty to get the budget and appropriations process done every year, but it will be something we are forced to come to. We will probably, not like what happens around the deadline, but that is an area where there is sort of forced cooperation. And I do agree with Norm. I mean, infrastructure is something we've talked about. In fact, I think every week has been infrastructure week for the last 52 weeks. But that is something that Donald Trump is a little different than his typical Republican. He's more willing to spend money on that. So that's a possibility. Prescription drug pricing is something also that the president breaks away from some traditional Republican policies. So like any time we have divided government, we shouldn't expect that we're agreeing on everything or working off someone's agenda. The parties are pretty far apart, but there will be some discrete things and some annual things that they have to work on.
Any others, Michael?
Well, the Republicans, as I understand it, actually did a pretty good job in the last Congress of passing appropriation bill, at least better than Republican or Democratic Congresses had done for quite a while. I agree with Norm and John about infrastructure being a serious situation. I would disagree on one point that Norm brought up at the end, which is that the popular will is declining. I went back and did the percentages of the percentage of the total U.S. population that the largest state had in every census going back to the 1790 census. And the disparities in state size were very large. They're not just a function of the 21st century. There's something that go way back to and the Constitutional Convention was very much aware of this. And that's why we had the ultimate, the Roger Sherman compromise of a House that is apportioned by population, the first regular census ever enacted, as far as I know, in any polity, and the Senate, each state getting 2 senators, and that provision by Article 5 not being changeable. I think that if you're an active politician, you try to win the game by, you don't just, you don't win the football game by yards gained. You win it by touchdowns and points after and field goals. And I think that, the Democratic Party has a problem in the concentration of its votes in certain areas. Not an Super Bowl problem. Hey, they nearly won in 2016. But realistic politicians adapt to the scoring system, particularly when you can't change it.
Michael, thank you. Here are a few other issues that you haven't mentioned thus far. Norm, you've written a lot about ethics reform, and is that one of the areas where you expect that we might see something, and will it go anywhere? Also, immigration, guns, or criminal justice reform? Anyone on the panel?
So first, one quick point. There were a number of appropriations bills passed. What you should keep in mind is they did a continuing resolution to get past the election for a fiscal year that ends September 30 until February. And Donald Trump is really spoiling for a fight here. And I expect a very strong chance of a government shutdown where he will demand full funding for the wall, and then we'll have more chaos. And chaos, as Democrats move aggressively on investigative fronts, is something to keep in mind. On ethics, I'm expecting that Democrats in the House are going to pass a robust package that will include significant ethics reform for Congress. And then we'll bring up a bill, and that will include, I hope and expect, something that moves away from the idea that a member of Congress can serve on a board and also have stock holdings in areas where they're making all kinds of decisions that can benefit themselves. It should be noted in this tribal environment that 2 indicted members of Congress, including Chris Collins, indicted on multiple counts for doing just that, were reelected. Along with, that's 2 indictments, and one who'd been convicted of assaulting a reporter, and then another who had been acquitted, a senator, Democrat from New Jersey, who was also reelected, which tells you that tribalism trumps ethics in many ways. But we're going to see some moves to reform the ethics process, including strengthening the Office of Government Ethics. And I expect we're also going to see Democrats try to move in some of the other areas that you've talked about, but that's far more laying down markers than it is enacting legislation. And enacting legislation is not a problem simply of divided government. The fact is the only significant accomplishment of the 2 years of the United Government was the big tax cut. They were failures in most of the other major areas, which we talked about policy, including Infrastructure Week, which is going on 104 weeks, not 52.
Yeah. Michael? Nothing?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
One result that I found interesting, Washington State had a referendum on a carbon tax attacking climate change. That's a solidly Democratic state. It's full of people that fancy themselves environments. It was defeated 56-44. You could imagine the liberal elites, some conservative elites favor action on this. You could imagine it happening much as the tax reform legislation of 1985-86 was put together on a bipartisan basis, but not by the characters who currently inhabit our executive or will inhabit our legislative branches.
Henry or John, do you see any areas of possible cooperation or anything getting done?
I don't see anything in addition to what's already been said. I think, the energy in both parties is to decimate the other side. I was looking at the exit polls, and it said that 77% of Democrats want Trump impeached. I think it's hard to sell a bipartisan deal to a party whose voters don't want to see the man on the other side of the deal in office. And I see little reason why, aside from something like infrastructure, where the differences could actually be bridged because the parties are so wide apart. I think looking back over the last decade, the failure of Bowles-Simpson to produce any, not even a supported reform, but a meaningful vote is a watershed, that you had the centers of both parties that were willing to do the sort of deal that had been done for decades in the past, but the extremes of both parties prevented that deal from going forward, and I think the extremes are only stronger now. Virtually anything that matters, I think, will not be acted on.
Quickly, you mentioned two issues: criminal justice reform. Actually, I do think that is something that this is the compromise people have been talking about for a long time. Maybe you could say the compromise between sort of more libertarian Republicans and Democrats for reducing over-incarceration. Some talk it could even happen, or some progress be made in the lame duck, but it is something the president is interested enough in, and I think could happen at least in the next couple of years. Immigration, I see the opposite, that we have very little chance that we have a meeting of the minds. The election reinforced differences. A number of the Republicans who lost were the ones who were the most willing to work on comprehensive immigration reform, work with Democrats, and I think we're going to be pretty far apart on that issue.
Norm, you had an extra.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. One issue to watch, interestingly, not in terms of action, but in terms of just the whole dynamic, is guns. The climate has changed. A sizable number of Democrats who got F ratings from the National Rifle Association won in districts where in the past you would have thought that would have been an impossibility. The Parkland kids, the incidents that we've had, another horrible tragedy with 13 people killed today, has changed the way that politicians talk about guns, and Democrats, I think, are going to push significantly on this issue. I didn't mention the leadership contest on the Republican side in the House. Paul Ryan, who probably had as much to do with making sure Simpson Bowles didn't go anywhere as anybody, is leaving, and there will be a contest between his presumed heir apparent, Kevin McCarthy, and Jim Jordan, who's under a cloud himself, but who would represent the Freedom Caucus. And my guess is McCarthy wins because he is very close to Trump. He's loyal to Trump, and Trump may weigh in there, but that will be interesting to watch. And finally, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is the forced ouster of Jeff Sessions, his replacement by a Trump loyalist, his former chief of staff, and what Congress might do to react to that if we do get, as we would expect, some curtailment of the Mueller investigation, or even Mueller being and his team being axed. And there are certainly reports coming from the Trump family that Don Jr. is anticipating he might get indicted very soon. And all of the things we've been talking about will be pushed to the side for a period of time. And how Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, would react if Mueller is fired is one of the vital questions we need to keep in mind.
Yeah. This is a related question. Are investigations of Trump's business practices, his personal practices, are they good politics, good governance going forward for anyone?
Well, I'm not sure there, it's, as somebody who was opposed to Trump in the Republican primary contest and went through various moments of dreaming, when they learn this about Donald Trump, their eyes will be opened. They will reject him. We're still waiting for that to happen. He did not make gains from his 46% performance, which is a problem for him and his party, but he didn't, the Democrats didn't necessarily come up with a formula that's going to improve on Hillary Clinton's 232 electoral votes. So I think those are challenges for both parties. I think Democrats have been, you don't hear Democrats telling those little Russia runs everything jokes anymore, do you? In my view, the Mueller investigation has fizzled, certainly in the fact of producing an ouster of the president, as so many Democrats were supremely confident 2 years ago.
Any other thoughts on leadership races on both the Republican and the Democratic side? John?
Well, the Senate, actually, it's the dog that didn't bark. We have two leaders who are going to be there. There's some lower-level leadership changes in the Republican side because of term limits, but I think the big story is that I think Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer have strong bases in their party and will be there for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, on leadership, I think it'll be interesting. A lot of the Democrats who were interpreted as not supporting Pelosi stuck to a line that they want new leadership in both parties. And I think, obviously the Republicans will have some new leadership in the sense of people moving up. But, if Pelosi wanted to shake up the underlying leadership, as Norm suggested, 2 years and then I'm gone, but also pushed away Steny Hoyer and everybody else and had much younger people behind, I think you could plausibly go back to your districts and say, well, the deal of getting new leadership meant keeping the old leader around for 2 more years, but look what I accomplished. And that would be the sort of deal that if I were Pelosi, I would try and strike.
There are other leaders that we need to talk about, though, and those are committee leaders. So I'll give you 4 names that will soon be closer to household words if they haven't been before. Adam Schiff, Elijah Cummings, Jerry Nadler, and Richie Neal. Chairs coming in respectively of the Intelligence Committee, the Oversight and Investigations Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee. And they're very smart, very capable people. I expect Democrats are going to staff up tremendously with skilled veteran investigators, and you're going to be seeing them a lot. On the Senate side, Republicans have term limits for chairs, and we're going to see a significant churn in some of those chairmanships. John is close to some of this, but we have a question of whether Charles Grassley will move over to chair the Finance Committee and give up the Judiciary Committee. We will have a new chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and we move from an avowed internationalist, Bob Corker, to somebody with almost a mirror opposite set of views in Jim Rich. And those chairmanships matter. They set agendas, as you saw with the Kavanaugh hearings, with the other hearings that have been held on judges. Who the chairman is can make a real difference. And so we're going to see a lot of changes actually in both houses.
John?
Yeah, I do think we're going to see some changes in the Senate committees. But I do want to go back quickly to the House, and that is, it looks like Nancy Pelosi is going to be the next speaker. I think originally we had thought, with all the pledges for people saying they're not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi, that not only you might go past Nancy Pelosi, but you really might skip past the entire leadership team because they're all 78, 79 years old. And I think there is a new generation, and I think it also would be a difficult thing for Democrats to pass by ultimately the Black Caucus and Jim Clyburn. There's never been a black speaker. And I think if you do go to a second generation, whether that's somebody new in the leadership who's seen as the heir apparent of Pelosi or perhaps just directly, the Black Caucus, I think, has a strong case to make that one of their people should be in there. Hakeem Jeffries or someone like this might be an interesting candidate.
Yeah, I think one problem for Democrats is if they want a new generation, Steny Hoyer turns 80 next year, Nancy Pelosi turns 80 the year after that. Pelosi and Hoyer are also highly competent people and do not seem to have lost any significant number of steps despite their considerable age. So there's less of a rationale, as I think Dianne Feinstein showed that she did in the Judiciary Committee Kavanaugh hearings. So it's going to be harder to turn over a new leaf, and I think that would apply to Jim Clyburn as well.
Do you all agree that Nancy Pelosi can hold back the forces pushing for impeachment, given the strong support among Democrats?
Yes. What we've seen from what Pelosi has said, what I think is going to be a consensus among a larger share of members is they're not going to get ahead of their skis on this issue. They're going to push for tough investigations. They're going to take their time. They're going to wait until we get a Mueller report, if we do get a Mueller report. I have a somewhat different view of what that report might have than Michael does. But they're not going to do things that simply satisfy the base. And the fact is, if we'd had a different set of election outcomes, if you'd seen super progressives who are highly visible figures win and win strongly, one, it would have a huge impact on the presidential contest. It would give enormous traction to those saying, never mind expanding your field and looking for independent voters, just excite the base. That's not there anymore. But it also gives much more traction to the pragmatists who know that if you push for impeachment, you're going to lose the House next time, but you're also going to lose the public now. So I don't think we're going to see more than a handful of people pushing that.
Yeah.
Well, I tend to agree with Norm that would be a good course for the Democrats to take. But I weigh that against, Molly Hemingway's report from her trip on the Acela, that Jerry Nadler is who is a very smart guy, to be chairman of the Judiciary Committee, wants to move ahead with this impeachment. And so, that's irresistible force versus immovable object.
John
sort of
Henry?
Time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree with Norman. I think the sequence is this: that there were plenty of things for Democrats to investigate now that will keep them happy and engaged and be able to be impeachment-like without impeachment. I think it will be tricky to think when we get closer to the next election. I think some of the presidential candidates will be pushing that issue, as typically happens. The party moves to the left or the right, and the people running in the primaries are not going to shy away from that issue. On the other hand, we'll be very close to an election. It will be very bad timing to do it then. But I think the pressure or the conflicts will be greater on whether to do it or not in the second year.
Yeah, I think I agree that they'll probably be able to hold off for a while, but I think it'll be interesting to see what happens if and when a Mueller report comes out, because Democratic partisans will read what's in that report much differently than other people. That they will read it as long as something is tangibly connected to the president, I expect you will see urge to move on that, but that may not be convincing to the middle. That plus the natural competition from presidential candidates catering to a base, 80% of whom want to see Trump impeached before the Mueller report. I think political considerations might look different in the House in August than they look right now.
Yeah, and we're going to have a whole bunch of Democratic presidential candidates, maybe tilted to the left. We saw what happened to the Republican Party when they had 17 presidential candidates in the 2016 cycle. That produced a result that was astounding, to use a term from Lincoln's second inaugural. And you've got, the Democratic candidates. I note that this election did not produce a Democratic governor in Iowa, New Hampshire, or South Carolina, where a incumbent governor might be a modulating force against extreme people in those three early contests.
Before turning to your questions, I want to spend just a few minutes on 2020. We provided a handout of the Senate and governor's races, but is Trump better off with the Democratic Congress going ahead to 2020? Any of the panelists?
Well, I guess a few of the things I would say is midterm elections are not predictive of presidential elections. We've seen plenty of people, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, do poorly in a first midterm and go back to win significantly. It really is a different election. There'll be different conditions on the ground. And one of those conditions will be the economy. The economy actually was certainly a help to Donald Trump now. Maybe it'll be just as good. That'll be good for him. But those things could change. A second point is that the candidates and who the Democrats pick matters. In a midterm, it's very easy to unite Democrats around an opposition to Donald Trump. But even if you pick a pretty good candidate, they all have their own flaws and their own strengths.
Well, we've last three presidents right after their first midterm, going into their reelection year, looked plausibly beatable. All three won. After the 1982 election and the 1962 elections, in which which produced President Party gains in the Senate, losses in the House, the president went on to, or the President Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, went on to landslide victories. Those augur well. On the other hand, Donald Trump hasn't really increased his positive feeling past the 46% he got last time, and you had to thread a couple of needles to win the Electoral College with that kind of percentage.
Can I actually just add one more point, which is more controversial, but if you look at political science models, which I think you have to do with some grain of salt, but they take fundamentals into account. Some of the big models can consider how the economy is doing, what the president's approval rating is, and also incumbency. Incumbency is an advantage. One of the best-known models, Alan Abramowitz's model. Again, I don't know conditions will be the same today as they are in 2 years, but if you plug in today's conditions into that, you see a Donald Trump victory. He's an incumbent. Economy's pretty good. His numbers are not great, but they're not so bad to bring that model down. So again, I don't want to hang only on the model, but there are some fundamentals that if things were as they were today, even though the election didn't go as well, those same conditions in a presidential election don't necessarily look that bad for Donald Trump.
You know, I was struck by many things in that press conference yesterday, but the fact that he took Republicans who lost, including Mia Love, who he considered to be a loser at this point, and went after them and belittled them by name, says something. It says he doesn't want to accept blame for anything. And while they would probably say that Trump was a weight that pulled them down, from his perspective, it was they weren't loyal enough to him. And that just tells me something about where we go from here, which is he is going to blame the Democrats in the House now for everything that goes wrong and find ways to draw those lines. I mentioned earlier the possibility of a shutdown. If the economy starts to go down, the theme, you can be sure, is going to be, see, when we were in charge, everything was going well, and then you brought them in, and look what happened. And that means we're going to see significantly more confrontation down the road, even if we do get an occasional moment of cooperation. And that'll be particularly true if the economy begins to sag, which it might. We're on a sugar high from the tax cuts, and tariffs may make a difference at some point. What we're going to see is far more of a blame game than there will be, let's figure out what we can do about this. With all of that, as I mentioned earlier, given the nature of the Electoral College, even if Trump lost massively in popular votes, he still is in a position to win re-election.
Henry, your thoughts, and in particular, I think you've written, or maybe I'm just imagining this, about the Democrats' need to nominate a woman?
Yeah, well, the Democrats, Norm was talking about 99 House Democrats. Well, that shouldn't surprise us in a party whose primary voters are between 60 and 63% women. For each of the last cycles, I'm writing an article on this, so I've looked at the data from 2004 to 2016. Each cycle that we have exit polling, the number of men who participate in the Democratic Party goes down. The number of women as a percentage goes up. Correlation with that is that with each 4 years, the Democratic number of people who call themselves moderate or conservative drops. The number of people who call themselves liberal or very liberal goes up. And I think what you're going to have is a Democratic electorate that will want to nominate a woman, and they will want to nominate a woman who satisfies the need to be viewed as progressive. And I think the debate will be over whether you want to be an open progressive or, as Norm says, a pragmatic progressive. But I think it's very likely that Donald Trump will be facing a woman. And that raises the thing that I think that if Donald Trump, who's known to be ruthless to subordinates, wanted to change the odds in his favor, I think he should dump Mike Pence and select Nikki Haley.
Now it's time for your
Or
questions. Now it's time
No,
for
it's Nikki Haley actually for a reason.
Yeah.
Is that the biggest thing that the Democrats continually push and the media continually pushes that he is a racist and a sexist. And that is one of the things that weighs very heavily on the Rhino educated person. So you say, I've changed America, and the person who can continue this is going to be a competent executive who understands foreign policy and ran her state, who's a woman of color, Nikki Haley. It will flummox the left.
All right, time for your questions, and we're going to have mics coming around, and we want you to identify yourselves, and we'll start right here. Right in the front. It's coming, Garrett.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell. I write the Mitchell Report, and thank you again for a stellar panel. I want to stay on the subject that we've been on and ask the panel, and perhaps Henry and Norm are best to address this. To what extent and in what ways do the results of this election begin to give some sense of direction to Democrats about who might be the most effective candidates? And I'm talking less about names and more about factors. In other words, less a personality contest and more about whether there's some learning here that to the extent that parties are capable of doing this and smart money is capable of doing this, it might say to Democrats, all right, this is what we need to be thinking about for 2020, the ideal kinds of candidates, rather than should it be a woman or should it be a, cantaloupe.
Well, yeah, I just go back to Democrats are coming historically in the last 20 or so years close with a authentic center-left to left Democrat in key Republican swing states, Florida with Gillum, and Abrams in Georgia, and Vito in Texas, and Sinema in Arizona. And so part of what I could see people saying is, look how close we came in these places. All we have to do is flip one of them and we win. But I think the more important question is, again, the Midwest, that you have to prevent Trump from picking up one of those big states that he didn't get. And that militates, in my belief, in favor of somebody who is not a strident progressive, but somebody who touches all of the bases but doesn't excite the fears, and that suggests to me somebody like an Amy Klobuchar would be much better for them than to pick somebody who would, obviously some of people are saying, well, Vito lost for Senate, Abraham Lincoln lost for Senate, and he became president, so let's follow that. But, somebody who's more of a shouter, I think is appealing to a wing of the Democratic Party, but not the way they should go.
Yeah.
So I actually go back to something Michael said, and I agree with it. Republicans had 17 candidates, and it was a zoo. You get 10 on the main stage, the other half on the kiddie stage. It's almost impossible to go from the kiddie stage to the main stage. Most of them are people who are unknown, except to the real aficionados. They get known in a debate, and each of them will have 7 or 9 minutes to make a point. And it depends more on what the zeitgeist is at the time than anything else. And it's not like you have party officials who can do the kind of analysis that Henry just did or that any of us would do. And if they did so, then they would pick an Amy Klobuchar who just soared in Minnesota and has extraordinary strengths. Or they'd pick a Mitch Landrieu, a former mayor who can unite black and white and is a pragmatic progressive. But we don't know what the zeitgeist will be and who those candidates will be. Now, having said that, if there are lessons learned, I think one is you focus on the issues that people care about, and health care was the one that Democrats just hammered away at over and over again. And I think we'll find that that was a key in their victories, that for an awful lot of Republicans, including some like McSally who might well pull it out, but people who proudly stomped on the Affordable Care Act and then turned around and had to say, yeah, but pre-existing conditions, well, nobody cares more about them than we do. That didn't work very well. It put them on the defensive, even if they managed to win. You're going to see a focus on those kinds of issues, but also what Beto O'Rourke did, I think, was less about mobilizing progressives. It was a broad, inclusive message. We all have to come together. It was that positive message that David Brooks wrote about in his column, but ignored what some of the candidates were actually doing. And that could work for a Beto O'Rourke, who has now a huge fundraising base, a lot of followers, and isn't going to be saddled with being a non-entity in an unproductive Senate. But you could also imagine that the zeitgeist is anger, and that's where one of these angry left-wing candidates could emerge, and it might be impossible to stop him given the nature of the nominating process. That's a nightmare, I think, for Democrats. It's also a nightmare for the nation if that's the kind of choice we face.
Are there any questions in this end of the room? Okay, I'm sorry.
Just quickly, a couple things. One, just to win in a primary, I think a big primary, you have to distinguish yourself and have something of a base. And really the two options are to have a good hold on the black vote or a good hold in the progressive wing of the party. And so I think some candidates who come out are going to have one, or you can even think of some candidates who might have both. And then just again to the general election, not that the Democrats have to put forth an African-American candidate, but boy, that would make a difference. And someone like Barack Obama, who was able to balance both parts of the party, you look at the 2016 election and you just bump turnout even up a little in the direction of where Barack Obama was, and that's a good winning formula for Democrats.
Question here.
Barbara Bowie Whitman, if it's my opinion, and you may disagree, but if in fact ever since 2010 when the Tea Party helped the Republicans gain a nominal but not necessarily working majority in the House. And so you labor under the fact of you control all three branches and you can't get anything done. If, in fact, what we have had is a non-working majority, a nominal majority, but it wasn't a working majority because the Republicans had too many fault lines, is the president better off with the actual loss of a majority since he never had a working majority?
Michael?
Well, it's as I think Norm or someone was suggesting, he gets a punching bag in the opposition party, at least on any issue where he wants to go after them, and he may get a situation where he could get an opponent that would be too far to the left, and he would get up. He would get some votes there that he didn't get last time. My answer basically, though, is we'll see.
Yes, question in the front here, and then one in the middle of this section.
Thank you all very much. I identify from the state of Wisconsin and a very red Republican area of the Fox River Valley that gave us Joe McCarthy, would have given you George Wallace, and helped give you Donald Trump. It's very heavily dependent on agriculture, the whole state. My question relates to, is there any chance for a red state that is either dependent on agricultural exports or, say, Japanese factories in North and South Carolina, auto factories? Is there any possibility for those red kind of states and districts to weaken if tariffs and trade begin to bite?
And I think they are already biting. Soybean exports are way down. But I think, an awful lot of the people who supported Trump, and that includes not just those in agricultural areas, coal mining areas and the like, are with him because they believe that he respects them and speaks to them, and that the elites have both ignored them and looked down on them. And we've seen now a whole lot of books, including one about Wisconsin, about the degree to which those values can overcome some economic trauma. I do think, though, if we get an extended period of a tariff war, and that war will hit agriculture harder than anything else, although it's now really hitting autos in a big way, that at some point it's going to cause some erosion of support. And, of course, this time in Wisconsin, we saw a very different set of results than we had last time.
Question in the middle.
Government.
Sure. I'm John Green. My question, I want to go back to infrastructure just for a minute, because I was thinking the way you were, and then I started thinking about this some more. So they're really far apart on how they're going to fund infrastructure between the Senate and the House. And then I hear the Democrats might reinstitute pay-go, another complication. And then are Democrats really going to give the president the photo op at the bridge opening, going into 2020? What about that as complicating factors to getting to infrastructure?
Well, one of the glories of our democracy is that we have had over the last several years, really since 1984, pretty close elections, serious competition, rising turnout. One of the problems you get with if you seek legislation or compromise is that parties that think they're at a disadvantage now, but they can win everything next time if we just hang tough, tend to hang tough and not do the sort of things that Dan Rostenkowski and Bob Packwood and Jim Baker did in the tax reform of 1985-86. And I think you brought up some of the points that are at issue there.
Yeah.
And Wisconsin, remember, voted for Ted Cruz in the primary in 2016 over Donald Trump.
In the back?
Thank you very much. Larry Checco, Senior Advisor to Serve USA. What are the implications for both parties should the Mueller report not see the light of day?
Well, the Mueller has indicted several people. We hear that I think that Democrats supposed that Mueller was going to do the sort of things that we saw in 1973 and 74 in Watergate, go up the chain of command, find violations of felony laws and so forth, and cause the president to lose all support in his party and resign from office in the face of impeachment and removal pending. It hasn't worked out that way. And we have the indictments that have been obtained have been about, Paul Manafort doing things in 2009 or some such year that he shouldn't have done. It doesn't look like we're going to. I think that the idea that this is going to be, remember all the Russia jokes. Everybody remember the Russia jokes. He was taking orders from Putin. This guy, the Russians were controlling the government and so forth. We've ended up with a more anti-Russian foreign policy than we had under President Obama. I think that this has not panned out to be a repeat of 1973, 74, and that if the Democrats hope to elect a president, they ought to start grappling with some of the problems, but also opportunities they face in the nomination process, in the legislative process, and so forth.
Any other comments
Well,
on that?
Yeah, Michael lives in a completely different universe than I do, I must say. We don't know what the Mueller report contains. We've never seen an investigation as leak-proof as this one. It's following a classic pattern of moving up the chain, and we haven't gotten to that point yet, and I suspect we'll be hearing a lot more about Russia before we're done. If the president had the attitude that Michael has, he wouldn't have been so concerned about the Mueller report and bringing in as the acting attorney general, instead of what would be the normal process, the deputy, bringing in a guy who's made his political career by going on CNN and saying, we got to quash this investigation. So I suspect there's something more there. If, in fact, the report is deep six completely, you're going to see a big uprising. But how that plays out in both parties, I'm not sure. Whether it means that senators on the Republican side go to their DEFCON 1, which is to issue tweets saying we are deeply, deeply concerned, instead of just we are concerned, to take it to another level, I don't know. We did have a bipartisan bill that passed the Senate Judiciary Committee to protect Mueller, and McConnell wouldn't bring it up. And McConnell now saying that basically trashing any notion of going further in these areas. Does he have the hold over his own members? I don't know. What would trigger an impeachment, no question in my mind, prematurely, would be if there's a move to fire Mueller or to make sure that whatever report emerges doesn't come out. And there's one other point to keep in mind. We had an election for an attorney general in New York. By the way, a lot of Democratic attorneys general elected across the country. Every candidate running in New York basically was red meat, we're going to take on Trump. We have probably some indictments at the state level brewing against some of the Trump children on fraud charges. We have questions about the Trump Foundation. How much of this could be done at a criminal level, I don't know. It can't be pardoned, of course. And then you have the Southern District of New York, which has a traditional level of independence from the Judiciary Committee that has been, some of the investigations have been farmed out there. And you have one final thing to keep in mind, which is there can be sealed indictments already issued or about to be issued that can be unsealed at any time, that once they're there, can't be stopped. So there's an awful lot of churning going on out there, some of which I think we will see moving to the fore within the next month or two. But we're in completely uncharted territory here, very uncharted territory.
Well, I would just say that Norm's inference that Trump must be guilty because he wants this investigation to stop, wanting the investigation to stop is also consistent with there being nothing to these charges whatsoever. For his point of view, it is a political irritant, diversion, and of course, fanned by a very sympathetic media to the anti-Trump cause. So I don't think it's dispositive one way or the other that he's irritated with this investigation.
Is there a final question? Yes, right over here. I want to say that one of the great things about this group, I think, as you can tell, we disagree pretty strongly among ourselves, but we've always been civil and we're also great friends. So, yes, here.
I'm David Smith of The Guardian. Do you think Donald Trump will feel vindicated that what he said about the migrant caravan moving to the border and all his racially divisive rhetoric, will he feel that in the midterms that worked and allowed him to declare victory? And if so, will he just pursue the same strategy in 2020? And does that mean things will turn ugly?
I think he'll feel vindicated whatever happens. I think that's one of the problems that with Donald Trump as a leader.
Yeah, I think it hasn't been a surprise. Donald Trump ran in the primaries on immigration. It's been an issue for him. I think the biggest issue in this election was Trump, pro-Trump, anti-Trump. But if you look at issues, Democrats cared most about health care. Republicans were most interested in immigration. And so I don't think immigration is going away. And divided government, again, the president is going to use some of his executive powers to do things in that area, as he has already. And so I think it's an issue that he's not going to back away from.
Henry, you.
I think you asked, you think it's going to get ugly as a consequence of something that Trump is going to do. I think it's going to be ugly anyway. I mean, you cannot underestimate the degree of loathing, hatred, and antipathy that the rank-and-file Democrat feels for Donald Trump. And you cannot underestimate the antipathy that a large portion of the Republican Party feels for the Democratic Party and what they believe are their willing co-conspirators in the media. And when you have 70 million or 80 million people who loathe each other, things are going to get ugly.
Paul Ryan, among others, tried very hard to get President Trump to change his approach in the final days and weeks of the campaign, and a lot of his political advisors did too. They prepared commercials on the economy, and he brushed them aside. Now, will he feel vindicated? The Senate ended up doing a little bit better, I think, than a lot of people thought, and some of those contests were won handily. Governorships in states like Florida and Georgia, you could argue that maybe drawing those lines brought out more Republicans and made a difference. So I don't see any reason why he would think that he should change the approach that he's used. It will be interesting now to see if the 15,000 troops stay on the border past this next week or two, and what actually happens if and when we get what will probably be just some stragglers from that 1,700-mile journey. But if there isn't a caravan, there'll be something else that will be used as an issue that gets your base excited and turned out. And that's the nature of our politics now. I think it's the mindset that he has going forward. But as Henry said, that aside, division and acrimony are the rule of the day.
And you do see some Democrats explicitly now calling for open borders. Anybody from another country that wants to come here can come here. I don't think that's a viable position, and it transforms what are potentially negatives for Trump and Republicans into positives.
On that note, I want to thank all of you for coming, but I want to thank two people in particular who were here with us in 1982, Susan Friedman there and Edwin Williamson. And I also want to thank my wonderful panelists for a very deep and serious discussion. Thank you for coming. Oh, and one final thing. We hope to be back in 726 days to discuss the results of the 2020 election. If we're alive.